Thank you for coming to my talk. Before I start talking about the topic I'll be discussing, I want to tell you something really funny and weird. I just came back from Ethiopia, where there was a major conference at the United Nations Center in Addis, um, organized by the UN Environmental Agency and ANAW, African Network for Animal Welfare. And at that conference, I was speaking. I talked about the same topic, and I have to tell you, it was so frustrating to be there and to listen to speaker after speaker after speaker talking about, oh, we're so cruel to animals. We have to take care of them better because we need their meat for food, we need their skin, we need them for entertainment, for experimentation. So that was all they were talking about. And I felt so out of place. Here I am in Africa, in my own country, um, among Africans, and I felt alien. And now here I am in Europe, the only pigmented person in this place, and I feel at home. Because it's all about heart. So I just want you to know that. So, my talk is about the looming threats to Africa and its people. Basically, intensive food production and a phenomena called land leasing. So, there are 4 types of intensive food production that are involved. One is factory farming, and that's the major one, monocrop production, use of GMO seeds and animals, and use of chemical pesticides and petrofertilizers. So what is factory farming? I mean, we all know what it is. It's a highly mechanized farm on which large numbers of livestock are kept indoors in very, very horrible conditions, with the main objective to maximize production at minimal cost. By the way, all the pictures you see below are factory farms in Africa. This is not from the US or Europe. So what's wrong with factory farming? First and foremost, especially for me, the main reason I talk about this is because it's so cruel, so unethical, it's ridiculous. The other problem is it exacerbates global warming. And if we think global warming is an issue now, when intensive agriculture, factory farming is fully implemented in Africa, it's going to be horrendous. So it exacerbates global warming because according to the certain organizations like the United Nations say that animals emit 14.5% of greenhouse gases. The World Watch Institute says it's 51. A recent study by the UN says it's 14.5. So whether it's 14.5, 18, or 51, at the end of the day, these are massive numbers, and they lead to major problems with global warming. Land degradation is another major problem. Land is degraded because animals are used for growing feed. I mean, the land is used for growing feed, but there's also other issues related to land degradation and deforestation, which leads to desertification and water shortages, and that is the use of degrading the land by companies that are logging the trees and clearing the land for grazing and for, again, growing feed, all of which leads to desertification. What does that do? Well, one of the things it does is water shortages. In Africa, already 1/3 of the communities are inhabiting areas that are stressed extremely. And a lot of the lakes, major lakes in Africa, the lakes like Lake Nakiyala in Uganda, Nakuru in Kenya, Lake Chad in Chad, Lake Tana in Ethiopia, are disappearing. And this is just a few examples. The other problem is that factory farming is unsustainable. You have basically genetically modified animals that are poorly adapted to local ecosystems. And imagine this, they need high quality grains that sometimes have to be imported. So you have an African country that can barely feed its own people, importing grains to feed animals in factory farms. It makes no sense. It is less efficient, produces less food per acre, and creates fewer jobs. So a lot of people think of Africa and African countries are very poor, beggars, with a lot of such starvation. And the reality is different. In the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of economic improvement. 8 out of 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. And so things are changing. Factory farming are coming into Africa in a big way, and a lot of countries have sophisticated factory farming setups. Some of these countries are, and this is not an exhaustive list, is South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Botswana. And countries that are coming up quickly are countries with less mechanized forms of factory farming, but are catching up. And some examples are Zambia, my own country, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. And the thing is, these African countries are teaming up with foreign entities that help them promote factory farming and make the need for factory farming more intense. South Africa, they're again, I'm just giving a couple of examples. South Africa, they've teamed up with Kentucky Fried Chicken, Ghana with Tyson's Chicken, both from the US, Zambia from a company called Tetra Pak, and Sweden. Mozambique is being supported by USAID, which, by the way, does a lot of work in different countries. In this case, helping them with their poultry industry. Bill Gates, who surprisingly is also supportive. He talks about veganism, supporting vegan industries, yet he funds poultry industries in different countries, including Nigeria. Ethiopia, working with a Dutch company to improve their poultry industry. So these are some of the things that are happening. The other thing, the other intensive production is monocrop production. So what is monocrop production? Monocropping is an agricultural practice of growing the same crop year after year on the same land. Now, it has advantages. You're using the same pesticides, the same seeds, and the same machines. And so it's not as, the yield is better. The most common crops that are grown are wheat, corn, and soy. The problem with monocrop production is it attracts larger population of pests, it drains nutrients from the earth, intense tilling leaves soil weak and unable to support healthy plant growth. Requires intense application of insecticides, herbicides, and fertilizers that cause problems for not only animals but humans. The fertilizers disrupt the natural makeup of the soil and contribute to further nutrient depletion. Another use is GMO seeds and crops. So GMO seeds and crops are crops and seeds that are genetic material that have been altered with genetic engineering techniques. Genetic material from a totally different species is injected into these crops and these seeds, and basically the reason is to resist pesticides, pests or herbicides, or to create other desired effect, to make these foods last longer or make them look more attractive for people to eat. Again, what do GMOs do? They decrease soil health, prevent some micronutrients from being absorbed into the body, contaminates non-GMO fields, and they're an ethical violation of species integrity. Chemical pesticides and fertilizers is another major issue. They contaminate soil, water, turf, and other vegetation. They cause human disease, kill birds, fish, insects, and other plants. Plants and pests develop a tolerance requiring even more harsher chemicals in future applications. So, these intensive food production, why are they being pushed and by whom? They're pushed because the idea is by doing this, you can decrease poverty, decrease hunger, and improve the economic conditions of these different countries. And there are time and time again, repeatedly, there are a set of countries and organizations and institutions that support the system. And mostly, as you may suspect, are countries and institutions from the global north. US, USAID, European countries, the UA, and institutions, especially the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and IMF. And so they do this by giving out foreign aid and using what they call structural adjustment programs, which now has a fancier name or called poverty reduction strategy papers. So basically, just to give you an example, the IMF says, you know, you guys need, Ethiopia, you need factory farms. We're going to give you money. We're going to lend you money so that you can build factory farms. But in turn, you have to change certain policies that we want you to implement. And some of these policies is decreasing tariffs on import from different outside countries, privatization, and then the deregulation of industries, which basically leads to neocolonialism, in short. I think one example would be what happened in Bolivia many years ago, where the locals fought back because I don't know if it was a French company, but some European company took over the water production and started charging the people money that they couldn't afford, and was, basically they were suffering, but they couldn't get any water to drink. So these structural adjustment programs lead to a form of colonialism that is different. The poverty reduction strategy paper is the same thing. The only difference is in the poverty reduction strategy papers, the countries help write the policies to enslave them. So the end result of implementing intense food production leads to destruction and poisoning of the environment, acceleration of global warming, exacerbation of poverty and hunger, loss of biodiversity, exacerbation of human and non-human suffering, and as I said, neocolonialism. So in our opinion, the causes of hunger, poverty, poor economic growth in Africa are different. There are many causes, many reasons. These are some of that I felt were very important. Wars, internal and external, which is not much of a problem now in Africa, but tribal and ethnic divisions are still a major issue. It's happening right now in Ethiopia, where ethnic division has become a big, big problem. Unfair national and international agricultural policies. One example of an international agricultural policy that's unfair is, one example is what President Clinton did to Haiti in the 1990s. The US government dumped tons and tons of rice in Haiti. The farmers that produced rice could not compete with the cheap prices. And so they went, belly up, and they couldn't, compete with it and became poor and destitute. So that's one example of international agricultural policies that affect countries in Africa. Social inequalities, unequal wealth distribution. Unlike Europe and the United States and Australia and some countries in Asia, one of the problems with Africa is you don't have a middle class. And as we all know, without a middle class, a country cannot grow. We have the 1% or less than 1% super rich, and the 80% bottom half that are extremely poor, nothing in between. And this inequality causes a lot of injustice. And this lack of justice, lack of opportunity for growth, lack of education, all leads to poverty and hunger and economic inequalities. Unfair policies of IMF and the World Bank, I already explained some of the ways they do that. And then, of course, there's a big problem with economic mismanagement. You can't blame everything on the Europeans, Americans, and institutions. Africans have to take responsibility. A lot of countries in Africa are corrupt, unfortunately. And imagine you borrow money from the IMF that's already going to strangle your country, and then on top of that, you divert that money back into the pockets of corrupt individuals that then buy homes in London, in Paris, in New York, and stash away millions of dollars. So it's a double whammy, and so the suffering is exacerbated. Poor governance is another issue. Unfair international commodity speculation, artificially increasing the cost of commodities in the international market or artificially lowering it affects farmers in Africa that cannot compete. Corporate control of food is another issue, and unequal distribution of food. So this is where, like, for example, ethnic division is an issue. The picture you see down here is an area in northern Ethiopia that my grandfather came from. This area, as you can see, is there's just dry land, nothing else is left. One of the problems with this area is the previous government that led Ethiopia for 20-something years, when they came to power, or when they were struggling to come to power, this part of North Ethiopia did not support them. And so after taking control of the country, there was a bias against this area because they weren't supportive of the government. And so when there was any issues with food, if there was bad weather and there was some difficulty with growing crops, the government would not send food. So it was not distributing the foods where it was needed because they were from a different ethnic background and they were not supportive of the government. Another phenomena that's recently, that showed up on the horizon is land leasing. Some call it agrarian colonialism. And basically what it is rich countries, mostly from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and some countries in Asia, including India, want to feed their own people because they don't have enough land, fertile land. So they come to Africa where there's fertile land and they lease it. The problem is, well, to start with, the proponents claim that these countries benefit from it because they get more money and they can build their infrastructures and improves the farming from subsistence farming to commercial farming. The problem is none of this is true. The amount paid to the host country is minuscule, it's ridiculous. And then they don't build infrastructures. In fact, like Indian companies will bring their own people, their own utensil products and material, build these facilities and hire their own people and displace the farmers. So this idea that it helps economically and helps infrastructure building is a hoax. The crops grown using large-scale quantities of fertilizers and pesticides damage the long-term sustainability of tropical soils unsuited for intensive cultivation, reduces the diversity of plants and insects and animals, causes water quality problems and shortages. There's dumping of toxic waste in lakes and rivers, harms humans and aquatic life, bioaccumulation of the food chain and high toxicity is caused, and environmental racism is the end result. And on a side note to this, and this is a theory I have, I can't prove it, and I'm trying to do some studies. I truly think that part of the toxicity we're seeing, and where toxic waste is being dumped in lakes and rivers, is causing serious human problems. I have a clinic in Ethiopia, and we see a lot of patients that come in, surprisingly, young people in their 20s and 30s with erectile dysfunction. They are impotent, and after ruling out all the common causes of erectile dysfunction, the only thing that's left is toxicity. Because the large number of young people who are coming with erectile dysfunction with no reason for it. They're young, they're not diabetics, they have no hormonal abnormalities, no vascular disease, no neurologic diseases. All the common things that cause erectile dysfunction don't exist. The only thing left is toxicity, toxic water ingestion, food ingestion. Pesticides are one of the common reasons for erectile dysfunction. And so I'm hoping to prove it, even though it will take some time. But this is what I call environmental racism. The other thing is cash crops, flowers, floriculture. It is devastating to the ecosystem in the countries that it's been instituted. Kenya was leading Africa in floriculture, and the land they used for growing flowers that is exported, it's not for the use of the people in the country, they're exported to Europe and the United States, and the companies that are exporting them are private companies that make money. So it never benefits the local people or the country itself, basically. And the same thing is happening now in Ethiopia. Not even 100 kilometers outside of the Ethiopian capital, they have these really fertile areas that can be grown to feed people. Land that can grow crops that can feed people. They're using it for, producing flowers. So what's the solution? Honestly, these are just my thoughts and recommendations and conclusions. There are better thinkers and more advanced academicians and politicians that may have better ways to make a difference. But in my humble opinion, the solution for Africa rests within Africa. For millennia, farmers have successfully practiced agricultural methods that have sustained the continent. What really is needed is to support and improve on their successful practices instead of shunning them and kicking them out and throwing them under the bus. In collaboration with ethical donors and civil societies, African governments should produce foods in ecologically sustainable ways, encourage domestic organic plant-based farming instead of factory farming, destocking herds, and implementing large-scale ecosystem restoration projects. I'm happy to say a couple of months ago, Ethiopia became the only country that planted over 3 million trees. They hold the record right now. It was India before. And so these kind of ecosystem restoration projects, even though are not enough, are going in the right direction. Reassessing policies and practices that lead to land degradation, desertification, and deforestation needs to be given priority. Launching educational programs to raise awareness on the effects of climate change on the continent. My organization, International Fund for Africa, a couple of years ago, teamed up with local NGOs, and we were going out into rural parts of Ethiopia to let farmers and individuals know about the effects of meat and dairy production on the environment. And surprisingly, truly surprisingly, they got it. They understood. It didn't take much to convince them of what we were saying. And I live in the United States where half of the population doesn't think global warming exists. So it's very interesting. And then avoiding policies that promote exportation of food produced on the continent or further industrialization of food production. Countries like Ethiopia, we're cutting up these poor animals and sending them to the Arabian countries. Botswana does the same thing and sends foods, meat products to Europe, and I think they're doing it in the United States too. Imagine, these countries barely can feed their own people, yet they're sending food to rich countries. Importing of GMOs needs to be stopped. I know at least 19 countries in Europe have completely banned GMOs. But in Africa, it's flourishing. And then, of course, banning land leasing is really a must. And finally, on a more broader perspective, creating a just and democratic system that protects the African people from unjust national and international laws are important, and working towards changing the political economic paradigm that puts profit over people, animals, and the planet is really, really important. As Gandhi once said, the world has enough to meet everyone's need, but not everyone's greed. Thank you. I would like to talk for a few minutes about a book I co-edited called Africa and Her Animals. So Africa and Her Animals came out in 2018. It's a philosophical and practical perspective. It was co-edited by myself and Rainer Ebert, a philosophy professor at Dar es Salaam University. It was published by University of South Africa. So quickly, the motivation and aim, contributors and book organization contents, first positive responses, and ways forward and how you can help is the outline of our presentation. So we hear a lot about human this, human that in Africa. There's tons of literature about the issues related to humans, but really nothing much about animals except the negative stuff. So this concept of human first, then other animals, we consider as a mistake. Little attention is given to the welfare and lives of non-human animals. And we believe that non-human animals matter in their own right. And that the welfare and well-being of animals, non-human animals and human animals, are inextricably linked. To address that deficiency, we came up with this book, which challenges the common view that animals are essentially inferior to human beings. It describes and critically discusses the status quo, demonstrates the interdependence of humans and other animals, and shows ways forward in improving animal welfare on the continent. Thank you very much.